実は、さっきも言いましたように、私は中国に行きました。
As I said before, I recently had an occasion to go to China.
で、中国では非常に、意義のある体験をしましたが、その後でですね、一人の日本の学生、日本人で中国に留学している女子の学生がですね、私に分厚い手紙を送ってきました。
When I went to China, there was a Japanese student there, a woman, who brought to me a very thick letter.
で、その手紙を後で見ますと、簡単に申し上げますと、その日本の留学生はですね、中国に留学して、友達ができてみんなに親切にしていただいて、非常に嬉しかったということをまず書いています。
And in that letter, this Japanese woman who was a student in China, when I read it, she talked about how she had made many friends in China.
ところが非常に親しくなると、中国の方がどんなことを言ったかというと、あなたと親しくなったから言いますがということを前提に、いかに日本の軍隊が中国で中国の人を虐待したかという話をしました。
But she continues by saying that when she became very close friends with some of her Chinese peers, then they would come to her and say, well, you know, it's because we're very close friends, there's something I have to tell you, and that's that we have a deep feeling of resentment towards Japanese army that came in during the war and committed many atrocities.
で、今申し上げませんが、その手紙には日本の軍人のした残虐な行為がたくさん書いてありました。
And many details of these atrocities are described.
で、彼女の手紙の最後はですね、先生、私はこれにどう答えたらいいのですかということで終わりました。
And the letter concludes with a question to me, namely, how should I respond to these Chinese friends of mine and their descriptions of the atrocities committed by the Japanese army during World War II.
で、その時に私は、実はこの原稿を出した後でその体験をしました。
And actually, this is an experience that I had after I wrote the summary, which you all have of my talk for this conference.
だから私がそう思ったのは、日本人は関係を大切にしているとか、仏教ではここまで関係を優先させると言いながら、その日本人、その仏教徒がなぜこれほどそのひどいことをすることになったのか、したのか、これが説明できなかったら、私の話はあまりにも一方的であるというふうに思います。
So of course, sociologically or philosophically, we can say that Japanese Buddhism and understanding of social relations is a relational model in which relationship between human beings or relationship between human beings in the world are very much valued and taken seriously. But of course, throughout history, it's not so simple, as we see in the case of these Chinese students who are not whose relationship to the Japanese invading army was not treated in a humane and compassionate manner.
で、今からは私の考えたことを申し上げますが、皆さんは皆さんでいろんな考えがあると思います。またディスカッションで聞かせてください。
So, of course, I'm relating my ideas, my experiences to you, but during the question and answer period, I hope that I can learn from your experiences and ideas as well.
で、私の考えでは、この初めに申し上げました母性的なお互いにつながっているあり方、あるいはこのように関係を優先する考えというのはですね、これをずっと無限に広げていくということは人間にとってほとんど不可能ではないということです。
And to so elaborate, based on what I've just said, to elaborate this relational model, which I believe is dominant in Japan, in which the maternal principle is so central, the maternal principle in which the mother loves the son or the child no matter what happens. I believe that this idea is in fact very important, but that it cannot be applied limitlessly, that there's a limit to the extent to which this kind of maternal compassion can be showed.
したがって日本人の考え方ではですね、内と外というのは非常に大事になっている。
Because of the practical limits of applying this maternal principle, one of the ways in which Japanese have sort of adapted to practical realities is to make a very strong distinction between insider and outsider.
で、私が今申し上げていることは仏教の教義について言っているんではありません。それを一人の人間はいかに生きるかということで申し上げているんです。
So what I'm talking about now is not something that's written down in Buddhist scriptures or Buddhist philosophy, which embraces a total vision of this kind of unconditional maternal love, but in the practical lives of the Japanese, how is it that things have worked out?
で、私としても何か内と外を決めていて、内の人と思った場合は、その内の人に対しては関係を大事にする。あるいはいつもどんな悪いことしても内のものだと考える。ところが外へ出るとですね、もう外へ出た時っていうのは、下手をするともう倫理というものがなくなるんだよね。
And so I wonder if it's not often the case in Japanese society that as long as one is talking about the insider group, there's a kind of unconditional acceptance and unconditional love. But once one goes outside beyond that boundary, then there's a kind of extreme contrast in which there are no ethics applied at all. And one might do anything to the other person.
これが仏教の教義の素晴らしいということを我々は知っていながら、私が個人としてそれを生きるときに一番大切なことではないかと私は思います。
So, Buddhist philosophy in principle extends this idea of unconditional maternal compassion to all things. But how is it when I try to live this out as an individual? And it's on this point that I think reflection is most important.
したがって、この考えを推し進めるならば、内から私が外へ出た場合ですね、内から外へ出た場合に、倫理を失ったような人間として行動しないためにはですね、この内をできる限り広げていく、自分が内と思っていることを超えて広げていく、内をみんなと世界に広げていくという努力をするか、あるいは外に出ても倫理観を持ちうるようなやっぱり個人といいますか自分というものをどうして作るかという2つの選択があるように私は思います。
In this regard, I think there are at least two possibilities. One in which one makes the effort to extend the circle of unconditional compassion outward. That, in some sense, reflects the Buddhist ideal of the bodhisattva, who doesn't simply limit to the immediate surroundings, but extends this maternal compassion out into the world, infinitely. Another possibility is, in regards to outsiders, although one may not have the same relationship to those who are insiders, one has certain standards of ethical and moral behavior that one constructs based on the idea of individual, an individual who takes responsibility for his or her own actions.
で、個人がその責任を持って行動するという点では、これは、欧米の生き方、宗教、あるいは欧米の倫理観の方が私ははるかに優れていると思います。
And in regards to an ethics or morality based on individual responsibility, I think we have to turn to the West, which is a long tradition of individual responsibility, and learn from various Western models of understanding.
で、したがって、私は非常にある意味ではジレンマを感じるようなことを言うのですが、仏教として平和共存を本当に考えるならば、仏教以外の人とどう接するのか、仏教以外の方とどう話し合っていけるのかということを本気になってですね、考えなかったら、これはもう今の現代においては通用しないのではないかというふうに思っています。
So, in terms of the way that Buddhists and Buddhism relate to the outside world, for example, to other religions, then there has to be serious reflections on what it means Japanese to engage in genuine inter-religious dialogue in terms of its inside-outside relationship? How is it that an individual Buddhist will go outside of the circle of his immediate community and take individual responsibility for engage and learning from encounters with different traditions, different spiritual paths?
私はだからといって欧米の個人主義が世界で一番優れているとも思うことはできません。
But at the same time, I'm certainly not endorsing the idea that Western individualism is the way to go.
アメリカの現状を見ていると、やはりアメリカの方は私が申し上げたような母性原理とか、あるいは関係を優先する考え方ということに対しても、ある程度の配慮を必要とするのではないかというふうに私は思っています。
So I believe that Americans too may have something to learn from this relational, maternally based idea of individual existence.
で、そのためにこそ、このようなシンポジウムもあるわけだし、そして、仏教とキリスト教の対話というふうな主題も出てくるのではないかと思います。
So I think it's along those lines, precisely, that a symposium of this kind has significance and interreligious dialogue between Buddhism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam can take place in a meaningful and fruitful way.
で、だからそれを言うのは簡単ですが、実際にすることは非常に難しいです。
Of course, it's easy to talk about this, but very difficult to put into practice.
というのは、おそらくキリスト教の方は対話をするということは私の考え方を持って相手と対話をする。だから私の考えがあってあなたの考えがあってこの対話を対決させるといいますか戦わすことによって何か答えが得ようとするでしょう。
In the case of a Christian who has been raised in a tradition of individualism, probably quite often the way in which they approach dialogue is with the assumption that I have my idea of religion or my idea of reality, and you have yours, and let's begin with an exchange of ideas.
ところが私が純粋の日本的に純粋にですよ純粋に日本的にブルーム先生と話をしたいと思うとまずお酒を飲むと思います。
But if I'm in a purely Japanese mode, for example, if I want to dialogue with Professor Bloom here, if I'm in a purely Japanese mode, the first thing I say is not what is your idea, but let's have some sake.
で、たくさん酒を飲んだ後で、ほとんどものを言わないけれども握手をして分かった分かったって言うんです。
So, at the end of several bottles of sake, without having said a word, then I'll shake his hand and say, yes, I understand. That will be the end.
つまり、この関係優先の考え方では言葉が発する前に関係が生じ分かり合っているということを考えています。
So in this Japanese relational model, it's the feelings and the sense that comes before any words are uttered that forms the foundation of the relationship and sense of I.
ところがおそらくキリスト教徒の方は言葉ではっきりと表現し、しかもどこが違うかということを明確にしたいと思われるでしょう。
But my experience tells me that, for example, for a Christian, it's really the ideas that really matter. What do you believe?
で、だからこの対話は本気でしようとする限り、日本語には命がけということがありますが、命がけの対話になるのではないかと私は思います。
So for genuine interreligious understanding, dialogue between Buddhism and other faiths, I believe it takes a supreme effort at which we risk the very being of our lives.
で、そのようなことの始まりとして、このシンポジウムがあると私は思っています。
And so I believe that the significance of a symposium like this bears fruit to the extent that we engage our full being in the process of learning and dialogue.
しかし、非常に嬉しく思いますのは仏教自身もですねやはりキリスト教などと対話可能なように変わってきつつあるのではないかというふうに私は思います。
And I think that some progress has been shown in terms of what I've seen, what I've heard, that Buddhism has begun to be able to engage in interreligious dialogue meaningfully with other faiths.
例えば、昨日、我々を歓迎してくださいまして、ここにもたくさんおられると思いますが、パーティーがありました。
As one example, I'd like to relate an episode from the welcoming party, which was so graciously provided for us for the symposium.
で、そのパーティーの始まるときにですね、その浄土宗の大変偉い、総務総長先生から先挨拶されました教学局長先生の挨拶がありました。
And at the beginning of the party, there were wonderful introductions made by the Secretary General of the Jōdo-shū and also the Secretary of Educational Affairs of the Jōdo-shū.
私は大変なことになったと思いました。というのは、大体偉い坊さんの話は長いんです。
And I thought, we're really in for it now, because when eminent priests get on a podium, they tend to talk forever.
長いだけではなくて、わからないし、面白くないのです。
It's not only that they talk for a long time, but usually I can't understand what they're talking about, and so it's not interesting at all.
私が食事するまで1時間は覚悟しておりました。
So the moment that they got up on the podium, I thought, okay, well, before we get served our meal, it's going to be at least 1 hour.
ところがですね、この2人の方はものすごい短い、すごく短くて分かりやすくて面白い挨拶をされました。
But unexpectedly, both of their introductions were very brief, and not only very brief, but very interesting.
だから私はもう仏教は変わってきつつあると。
And so already I've been able to see evidence of the transformation of Buddhism.
私の話もあまり長くならない間にこの辺で終わりにしたいと思います。
And so also my talk as well, before it gets too long, I would like to end it here. Thank you very much.
On schedule, so I think now that we will take our coffee break, and maybe at that point we have some feeling before talking. Session rather abruptly because I thought I was following the sensei's advice that we should drink and have relationship before we speak. So I realized that people didn't get the point. So I'm sorry if I seem very abrupt at that point, but I think we've had a very stimulating presentation this morning by Professor Kawai, which should activate our dialogue between each of us. We see through his paper the importance of understanding cross-culturally the nature of relationships with each other, and to perhaps learn from the Japanese perspective and experience in human relation that relations are prior to the existence of the person, and that we are really the product of all our relationships. And so I won't take any more time away from the discussion, and so I will moderate. If you raise your hand, I will try to keep track, and so each person will have opportunity freely to speak. So if there are any questions or issues that you would like to respond to in Professor Kawai's paper, please do. Yes, Professor Ahmed. Before he begins, perhaps if you line up by the microphones, would also facilitate the order of questions.
Professor Kawai,
Yes, please.
that was a very enlightening paper I've heard, and I compliment you for your thoughts. I was going to begin by saying, inviting you to have sake with me later on. The thought that I had was, you mentioned that in the Japanese tradition, there is an inward lookingness and there is an outside lookingness. That's very profound. And my question was not so much towards peaceful coexistence as just for the sake of learning. Is that the basis for the hiragana and katakana methods of writing, that one is for us inward looking and then katakana being used for outsiders? Thank you.
されてないですね。まずは先生の素晴らしいご発表をお聞きしまして、学ぶところたくさんございましたが、後で一緒にお酒が飲める機会を楽しみにしてます。でも真剣な話、ちょっとお伺いしたいことは、先生が内と外の話をされましたけれども、これは例えばカタカナとひらがなとも関係がありますでしょうか。
これはカタカナひらがなはもう全く関係がございません、ありませんです。で、漢字とかそういう文字とは関係がありません。
So, I did talk about the relation between language and understanding of sound and relations, but this has no relationship to the different scripts that are used in Japan, whether it's the phonetic scripts of katakana and hiragana or the characters, Sino-Japanese characters. Anybody else?
I'm a graduate student, and I just recently wrote a paper on the self-inquiry method of asking, who am I? And I was surprised to find a reference that Carl Jung did not believe in the concept of anatta, or no self. Can you comment on that?
私は今大学院でいろいろ研究しているものですけれども、自己を尋ねるというような心理学の方法を今研究しておりまして、その中で、ユングは、仏教でいう無我、あなたという概念に賛成しないということが書かれた後にびっくりしたんですけども、そのことについて先生はユング心理学の、専門家ですからちょっとお聞きしたいところです。
ユングはですね、仏教のみならず東洋の思想に対して当時ですね、ヨーロッパ人にしては非常に珍しく非常に深い理解があったと思います。
I believe that Carl Gustav Jung, founder of analytical psychology, was someone who, for his time, that's the late 19th, early 20th century Europe, studied not only Buddhism, but many other traditions, Asian religious traditions, and had much more knowledge than many of his contemporaries.
ただ、そのユングはですね、やはり自分自身が西洋人であってキリスト教徒であるということを非常に大事にしております。
But as much as he studied and was influenced by Asian religious and philosophical traditions, Jung was a person who clearly saw himself as rooted in Western intellectual traditions and in the Christian tradition.
で、したがって東洋のことを非常に理解してもですね、それにこう溺れてしまうというんですか、あるいはもうそれに自分を失ってしまうということを非常に警戒していたと思います。
So as much as he found Asian religious traditions and philosophies attractive and significant, he was very conscious not to try to become like an Asian Buddhist or an Asian Hindu, and to be very cautious of the limits of what he believed he could and desired to realize in his own being.
したがって彼はその西洋的な意味におけるイゴですね、そのイゴコンシャスネスということを非常に大事にしておりましたので、すぐにですね、まっすぐに無我という考え方を受け入れるということに対してはある程度の抵抗を持ったのではないかというふうに私は思います。
And for this reason, he placed a great deal of importance on the Western concept of ego consciousness. believing that that was essential to who he was as a person. And for that reason, he found there was a limit to which, as much as he may have found it attractive or significant, incorporating ideas like Buddhist notions of no self.
で、彼は囲碁は大事だけれども、それに対してセルフという概念を言うわけですが、このセルフっていうのは今おっしゃった無我なんかに非常に近いんですけれども、やはり囲碁とセルフというこの対立を非常に彼は大事にしたので、無我というのをすぐに受け入れることができなかったのではないかと思います。
In contrast to ego consciousness, there is for Jung the reality of the much larger self, which envelops and embraces ego consciousness. And this Jung's concept of the self, I believe, in many ways is very similar to the Buddhist notion of no self. However, because Jung conceived the relationship between ego consciousness and self in his own particular way, in which they were both complementary but also in conflict with one another, that there are important differences between his understanding of the structure of consciousness, the structure of the Western self, and Buddhist understanding of no self.
Before, maybe the speakers, the questioners could just give their names so it'll be a little more personal. So when you come to the mic. Please go to the mic.
Well, perhaps you have also a follow-up on this point. But of course, the theologians, they sometimes have problems. And I was wondering, we have been talking about the difference between kind of American psychology or Western individualism and Japanese sense of relationality. But I was wondering if Professor Kawai could comment about within Japanese, within American, within the human family, there are also different kinds of lifestyles or personalities. Some are more conducive to dialogue than others. I've at least found that.
私は仏教とキリスト教の対話に携わっているものとして一つコメントと質問させていただきたいと思いますが、ここ何年か、この仕事に携わってきて、よく仏教の方と、キリスト教の方の間で、どちらも例えば瞑想、メディテーションをなさっている方は、お互いに非常に共感し合うことが多く、むしろそのキリスト教の場合、他のキリスト教徒とよりも、仏教徒の方で瞑想しておられる方と、そしてその自分との間に何か共鳴するところが、よくあると。あるいは、その社会問題や環境問題に取り組んでいる者同士の方がむしろ自分の宗教伝統の、中にある他のものとの関係よりも親しい場合が、よくあると。ですからこれはその河合先生がおっしゃった内と外の関係につながるものですけれども、何か、日本の仏教内のいろいろ違いや問題、あるいはアメリカ文化や、考え方の中の多様性の問題、などに、一つコメントしていただければ幸いなんですが。
The gentleman there was, unless, as David said, do you want to continue this discussion? Yeah. Is that okay?
I'll come here.
No, maybe he could ask his question. He was ready. Yeah. Those are.
I have two questions. First, I have to say I appreciate this lecture, and especially the lecturer's effort for peaceful human coexistence for the 21st century. I think this effort is very precious to me. upon human survival. I think now there is a risk of human destruction, especially now we know the new nuclear testing in India and Pakistan. This is a real threat to the world peace and to the human coexistence in the 21st century. And I remember that Einstein, the great mind of this century, once said, the release of the atomic energy has changed everything except here, well, the way of thinking. Now he added that if human beings want to survive in the future, they have to change their way of thinking. I think Buddhism is a way of thinking and a peaceful way of thinking. And so I don't know whether I'm right to understand that here, peaceful human coexistence in the 21st century should be based upon survival. This is my first question. I think when many intelligent people now begin to understand if human beings want to have the world of peace, and ethical culture is needed. I think maybe the dialogue between different religions is to establish an ethical culture. This is my first question. The second, about, I'm from China. I'm a Chinese ethnic American. I personally was also a victim of the militarism, Japanese militarism. I almost died by the bombing of the Japanese aeroplanes. And the speaker has just raised a question and how to understand it. You know, the Japanese woman who studies in China, put this question to them. And I think, and how do I understand history? And how do I deal with history, the tragic history? I think this speaker is, well, a Jungian psychologist and practices, well, analysis, psychology analysis. I know very little about Jungian psychology. To my knowledge, Jungian psychology is parallel to the Chinese Taoist philosophy. And Taoist philosophy is in fact a philosophy of opposites. And so my answer is, I think that Japan, in the past, in the World War, the maternal compassion was not dominated. At that time, maybe the paternal cruelty was dominating. That is why we had so many armies atrocities. And but now, well, everybody can see that Japan now is getting richer and richer, and she has sent such delegations as this, here to America, to preaching for peaceful human coexistence. So it means that now the maternal compassion in Japan is getting the So that's a good thing. I understand, well, like this. If that woman, Japanese woman asked me, I think we should have a correct attitude towards the problem left by history. We should be good at distinguishing these two sides. Well, maternal compassion and paternal cruelty. And I'm very glad that maternal compassion is prevailing in Japan. Now, I don't know, am I right or not? Please,
ちょっと簡単に通訳させていただきますが、まずは河合先生の非常に有意義素晴らしいご講演をいただきましてありがとうございました。質問は2つですけれども、この、今回のシンポジウムのテーマ、その平和共存の問題をめぐって、私はどうしてもその生存の問題ということを考えなくちゃならないと。例えば今はインドとパキスタンの間にその核兵器の問題が起こってますけれども、いかにして、こういうような問題を考えて、そして正しい、倫理思想を打ち立てることができるか。そして第2に私は中国系アメリカ人ですけれども、戦時中は中国で、日本の軍隊の爆撃の下で苦しんだ一人でありますが、これは歴史的な問題で先生がその、女子の学生さんの話を取り上げたときに私はそれをどういうふうに考えたらいいかと思いまして、先生はユング派の分析家で、中国の同郷思想と、その響き合うところがあるのではないかと思いますけれども、戦時中の日本は、どちらかというとその、不正原理に基づいて戦争を行ったのではないか。で、現在の日本はどちらかというと母性原理に戻り、もっと慈悲深い態度を、ただ単に国の中だけではなくて、世界にも、持つ、ことができているのか、あるいは、それに実際どうなっているのかということを私は気になっておりますが。
初めの質問
宗教内のその多様性をどう考えますか。
初めの方にお答えして、後で2番目の方にお答えします。今言われましたように、キリスト教の方も仏教の方も対話をする前にメディテーションの体験があるかどうかということを言われたのは、私は非常に大切なことだというふうに思います。
So, there are two people who raised questions. First, I will reply to Professor Chappell, who raised a question about differences within traditions. Specifically, I want to focus on the issue of meditation. I think that when, for example, Buddhists and Christians are both engaged in a contemplative tradition or meditational tradition, then I think this is very significant.
私は冗談半分に、お酒を飲んでということを言いましたが、これは私は俗人ですのでそういう表現をしましたが、宗教家であれば瞑想してというふうに言うと思います。
So I have, but only half jokingly said, well, you know, from this relational model, I would have a few bottles of sake with Dr. Boone. You know, as a person who's not a monk or nun, I mean, that's the way that I would express it. But I think if you transfer that to the interreligious dimension, I think there are significant similarities between my idea of sharing sake and sharing meditational experiences.
つまり酒もそうですが、メディテーションの場合もっとそうだと思いますが、メディテーションによって我々の通常持っている意識とはレベルが変わるわけですね。
Because whether we're talking about sake or meditation, of course, there are great differences in degree and perhaps quality as well. But in either case, there is some change in the very mode of our consciousness, the mode of our being.
だからその通常のレベルではない意識体験というものを共有しているこの関係というものと、私が通常の意識で例えば 今お話しするというのとは種類が違うと思います。
I believe there is a qualitative difference between a conversation or dialogue that takes place in our usual dualistic or discursive mode of consciousness and that which is based on sharing a qualitatively different kind of awareness or consciousness.
だからこのメディテーションということを共有して話をされると、これはそのような共通のベースの上で対話ができますので、これは非常にしやすいのではないかというふうに思います。
I actually believe that when one shares this kind of contemplative awareness, contemplative consciousness, or meditational consciousness between two people, that it greatly facilitates dialogue and conversation.
これは素人の発言ですから間違ってたら申し訳ないんですが、私の考えている宗教というのは今言われているようなそういうレベルの違う意識体験とどっかに持ちながらですね、それをベースにして考えるものだと思っているんですね。ところが宗教体系というものができてしまうと、その体系化された宗教を、頭で勉強する人はですね、そういう内的体験を抜きにして知的に体験だけ、持つ人がいるんじゃないかと思います。
And so I believe that it's actually very important for interreligious dialogue and dialogue of various kinds to take place with some common basis in this deeper level of awareness. But what happens is when there's this kind of experience, very often this is then formulated into a systematic understanding of reality or of religion, and people who only look at the system of ideas then have a harder time. So Professor Chan will refer to theologians sometimes having more difficulty than people who are based in meditation.
だから今おっしゃったことが非常に大切で、そのような体験を共有しながら対話をする限り、いろんな異なる宗教でも対話が可能になっていくではないかと思っているんです。
So although there's great differences between the world's various religious and spiritual traditions, as long as we are able to tap into this deeper level of awareness, even though there may be differences even there, that I believe that dialogue is facilitated, made easier, and also more significant.
それでは次の方のご質問にお答えしますが、中国の方が質問してくださってコメントしてくださって非常に嬉しく思いました。
So now I will respond to the second questioner, and first I want to say that I'm very grateful that a person who is Chinese background, Chinese American, raised these questions for me.
で、初めに言われたように、この人間の平和共存ということはもちろん生存の問題につながっていくわけで、その時に我々はこのアトミックボムですか、この核のエネルギーということを不問にすることはできないと思います。
And the question that was raised about the theme of this conference, peaceful human coexistence, as the questioner said, I believe that we cannot, given recent events, India, Pakistan, escalation of competition around atomic warfare, and the fact that it's always been there for us. When we look at these things, we cannot talk about the theme of this conference apart from a consideration of issues of human survival.
しかし私はその宗教の次元でいうと、キリスト教と仏教が対話をするということは、これはうっかり間違えれば核戦争と同じぐらいの大変なことをやっているんだという自覚が必要だと思います。
And so, at one level, intellectual discussion of conversations between religious traditions such as, for example, Buddhism and Christianity may seem quite distant from issues of survival involving, for example, the atomic bomb. But in another sense, what I would like to say is what takes place when, for example, Buddhists and Christians dialogue with one another can be just as intense and explosive as the atomic bomb.
だからアトミックエナジーですね、核のエネルギーをいかにして平和利用するかということは大変な難しい問題ですが、核のエネルギーを平和利用するほどの努力をしなかったら、私は異なる宗教の間の会話というのは成立しないというふうに思います。
When we think about atomic energy and to convert this energy to peaceful use, or peaceful expression requires a tremendous amount of effort. In order for interreligious dialogue to be truly meaningful, I believe we need to exert the same amount of energy and effort as it requires to take atomic energy and to transform it into peaceful purposes.
で、今のことを逆に言いますと、このような異なる宗教の間の対話を真剣に行っているということは、私は間接的にはその核の爆弾の防止につながっているのではないかとさえ思っています。
Or to state things conversely, I believe that to the degree that we are actually engaging in serious interreligious dialogue, in fact, has the effect of reducing the risk of atomic warfare.
で、次に日本人の問題ですが、私は私なりの答えを言ったんですが、中国の方が答えを言ってくださって非常に嬉しく思います。
So, of course, I gave my own response to the state of Japanese culture and the problem that the Japanese student brought up in relation to her experiences in China. But I'm very grateful that a person of Chinese background gave his own response to the situation.
で、特にダオイズムを使われたんですが、おっしゃった通り、ユングは非常に強い影響をダオイズムから受けていると私は思います。
And as it was mentioned, Jung was deeply influenced by Taoist ways of thinking.
で、ダオイズムのシンボルがありますね。白と黒のシンボル。あれはよりたくさんのユング派の人が喜んで使っているシンボルです。
So we all know of the yin and yang symbol, which is fundamental to Taoist way of thinking, complementary polar opposites, and that symbol has been very important in the tradition of Jungian psychology.
ただ今おっしゃったことには私はちょっと賛成できないんですが、私の申し上げているパターナル、マターナルという言葉は、これはむしろ西洋の方には理解されやすいんですが、日本人も含めて東洋人にはよく誤解されるというふうに私は考えています。
One point that I do have to point out is that the way in which you talked about the paternal and the maternal in relation to World War II and the time and the period after, I think is slightly different from what I was trying to say. And actually, generally speaking, I believe that Westerners have an easier time understanding my explanation of this often than people in Asia, Japanese, Chinese, and others.
というのは私の考えではですね、日本の軍隊のした残虐性はむしろマターナルクリエイティというふうに呼びたいと思います。パターナルクリエイティじゃないと思います。マターナルな残虐性。
Actually, what I would like to say here is that the actions and attitudes of the Japanese army during World War II reflect a kind of maternal cruelty rather than paternal cruelty, and I'll explain what I mean by this.
で、というのはさっきも言いましたように、日本のマターナルというのは自分たちの間だけですね、自分の国だけでマターナルと考えていて、それを外へ出ていくときにはまるっきり裏返すからですね、非常に残虐なことです。で、パターナルなその残虐性というのは、これはまた味が違うと私は思います。
And what I mean by that is that in the Japanese case, as in the case of a mother who will do anything to protect her children within her family, may also engage in tremendous acts of cruelty or atrocity towards those outside of her inside circle. In that sense, there's no question of the tremendous atrocities and negativities perpetrated by the Japanese army during World War II, but I think it's of a different flavor or of a different kind than that which is perpetuated by a paternal mode of engagement.
で、この問題、言い出すと非常に長くなりますので、これぐらいでこう言っておきますが、ただ今おっしゃったこの陰と陽ですね、 られているとか、世界のことを見ておられるという、そういう基本的な態度は私は非常に面白いというふうに思います。
So I don't want to take up too much time on this one particular question, but so despite certain points where I wanted to clarify, the basic idea that that there is a complementary relationship between the yin and the yang, or between different signs, and that this is reflected in movements in history, I think, is very significant and a point which I fundamentally agree.
長い間待ってましたって、自分の質問が忘れそうなんですけど、いや、そうではなくて、今の中国系のアメリカ人の方と川先生のお話、大変興味深く聞いておりまして、自分の質問が本当に忘れそうでございますので、ちょっと見ながら質問させていただきます。私自身は日本の仏教の僧侶であり、司会師でもあります。一度か林先生にお話聞いた方もありますけど、今日は今先生のお話大変簡潔で明瞭でございまして、質問することないようなんですけども、その仏教徒とキリスト教徒の、あるいは日本人と欧米人の思想の違いという、そういったことではすごくよく分かったんですけども、この人間というこのものをいわゆるホモ・サピエンスという見方から見ていきますとですね、その人間が21世紀にですね、どのようにして平和共存できるのかというふうなことを考えていったときに、生物学的な見方から見ると、このホモ・サピエンスというのが利己的遺伝子を持っていると、この利己的遺伝子のなせる、これをどういうふうにこの私どもの知恵でですね、コントロールするのかといったことがですね、大変重要なことになるんじゃないかなというふうなことを思っているわけなんです。それでいまだにこの世界中がソビエト連邦が崩壊してまして、それで戦争なくなったかと思ったんですけども、この民族戦争が起こってくると、この民族戦争が起こってくるという、起こり続けるという、そこにですね、いわゆるホモ・サピエンスの持っている悲劇っていうんでしょうか、そういったものがあるんじゃないかと。最近ではセルビア半島の長い戦争ですが、そういったものがある。これをこの宗教家、あるいはこの仏教徒としてですね、どのようにこの対応していくのか、あるいは思考していったらいいのかといった点についてですね、先生のお考えをお聞きしたいと思います。
Having had an opportunity to listen to the previous questioners whose ideas, comments, questions I truly appreciated, especially a question about Japan and China raised by the Chinese gentleman. Completely absorbed and I almost forgot my own question. But in any case, I do have a question, and that revolves around Professor Kawai discussed various relationships between Buddhism and other religious faiths, or between Japanese Buddhists and peoples in the West. But I wonder if there isn't a more universal question that revolves around the existence of human beings biologically as Homo sapiens. There's this notion among biologists that we have a selfish gene. And if that's the case, then how do we overcome that? For example, we see this in many problems in the world. Ethnic warfare seems to be revolved around selfish concerns. So how do religious peoples, or specifically myself as a Buddhist priest, deal with what seems to be intrinsic selfishness of human beings?
大変大切で、しかも非常に難しい質問で、お答えをするよりは一緒に酒でも飲みたい感じです。
This is a very important but very difficult question. And actually, I wonder if instead of butting heads in the realm of ideas, we need to drink sake around this.
で、少し真面目に答えますと、利己的遺伝子というのはこれは自然科学の概念です。
But more seriously, I do want to address the question, and this idea of the selfish gene, we have to first understand that this is a concept of modern natural science.
で、近代の科学というのはたくさんのことを説明し、しかも非常に有用でありますが、これは全てを説明するわけではありません。
And with the modern natural science is very powerful in explaining and understanding various phenomena, including human behavior. But I think we have to realize that there is a limit to the power of modern natural science.
そのことを明らかにするために私はよく言ってるんですが、私のところに訪ねてきた方で、相当なデプレッションになっておられた方がですね、それはなぜかというと、自分の目の前でですね、自分の愛人の方が交通事故で亡くなるのを見てしまった。そのためにデプレッションになった方がおられます。
To illustrate my point, I want to talk about one case that I had. A person who came to me very depressed because right before their eyes, they lost their lover to an automobile accident.
で、その方、私に会うならですね、なぜ私の愛人が死んだのかということを尋ねていました。
And the moment this person came in, sat down, and began talking, this person said, "Why is it that my lover died and was taken away from me?"
私はもちろん答えられません。しかし、自然科学者はすぐに答えます。それは出血多量です。
I didn't have an answer for this person, but natural science does have an answer. Loss of blood. Massive loss of blood, that's the reason.
つまり、その人がなぜ恋人が死んだのかっていうのは、その自然現象としてのなぜを聞いてるんじゃないです。なぜ私の恋人がなぜ私の前にで死んだのか。
So of course, the person is not asking a question about the lover's death as a natural phenomenon of modern science. The question is not why did he or she die. The question is why did I lose her? Why is it that I had to suffer this loss in my life?
それは私の死についても同じです。
And the same thing can be said for one's own death.
私が死んだ場合ですね、医者は必ず説明ができると思います。自然科学的説明が。しかし私はなぜ私が死ななくてはならないのか、そして私の死とは何かということを考えた場合に医学的な答えには全然満足できないと思います。
So of course, after I die, the attending physician will immediately be able to give the physiological or medical explanation of how or why it is that I died. But such explanations are completely useless for myself as a whole human being who has to face the question, why do I have to die? What is the meaning of death?
私にとってこの世界は何か、私にとって私の命とは何かということに関しては自然科学は一切答えないんです。
Why is it that I live and I die? What is the meaning of my existence? These are questions to which natural science has no answers.
だから自然科学は言っている自己的遺伝子は自然科学的な意味では正しいです。しかし自己的遺伝子を持った私がいかに生きるか、で自己的遺伝子を持った海野さんと私はいかに生きるか、これは自然科学は全く答えることができません。
So, this is not to negate the biological theory of the selfish gene. We don't deny this. But the question is, I, myself, who possesses this selfish gene, how is it that I must live? Or between myself and the translator, who also has a selfish gene, I would assume, how is it that we live? How is it that we engage in dialogue and conversation?
で、それに答えるものとして私は宗教があると思っています。
And it is in response to that existential question, which cannot be handled by natural science, that religion exists.
したがってこれから先ほどから言ってますように21世紀において私は宗教ということは大変大切なことになると思っています。
And precisely because of this, I believe that religion is so important in the coming millennium.
そしてその時にやはりその同じ人間でありながら異なる宗教を持っているということですね。これは本当に大変なことなんです。で、それを解決するための努力、そういうことがですね、この世界の平和ということに貢献するというのは私の考えです。
And as never before, as this century comes to a close, and as we face the next century, the next millennium, we will have to really engage in the question of how is it that we as peoples of different faiths, different traditions, come together in facing the fundamental questions of human existence.
Sure. Please.
My name is Kalani Nabriga. I'm with the Temple of Lono here in Oahu. I'm also a native Hawaiian. We are a traditional oral culture, and it is based in the foundation of a spiritual land base, the Puhono. And these spiritual land bases are recognized on there are 4 of them, one here in Oahu, Puanua Lehua, on the Big Island, Haliokeawe, in Kauai, Manoa Kalanipo, and on Maui, Pi'ilani. Now these are ideas that we are an evolutionary, the human being did not come first. That we start from the polyp and we go through the kumulipo, and somewhere along the line, in the understanding of what the broad water is and the narrow water is, the male and female. But we also have this saying in the concept of Lono, these 4 elements. In chronological order, the ku, the ocean first, then the sun that heats the ocean, evaporates the water, and then you have Lono, which is our doctrine. He must call this process where the cloud hits the top of the mountain and then participates into rain, the final god, Tani, what we call the kumulipo of the temple. That what we say in basically is you must take the stone and put it in the water before the seaweed grows. Okay. So we have a basis and we look at that first. In our culture you'll find 2 priesthoods. One, Ku, and all his temples are located along the coastal area. Lono is located in the deeper valleys. One temple has the concept of death, the other peace. It is long in history to explain this, and I speak this because this conference has been held here. Ku is the warrior that he is there at the ocean. When you say the inner chosen people, Ku is the one who protects us. If someone comes from the ocean to take my goods, he will call his ancestors from his altar there at the ocean. He is the first defense. So if he takes, he must take a life. And in that cause, we have been incorrectly represented as a warring culture, because the temple of the warrior of Lono, his as a warrior is a second defense. And that second defense is if the warrior, the temple of Ku cannot hold back the invader. And I speak this as an island concept. And then Lono is the last defense. Okay. Now, these 2 temples are based on a worship or a covenant of these 4 elements for staff of life. So Lono's staff of life goes further in this concept of war. And that is that, what is he protecting? And then I'll get into your subject of the paternal. He is protecting the woman. There is better to have 100 women left than 1 warrior than the opposite. And this is a well-kept secret in our culture, as evidence of the last remaining monarchs of our big women. It is also in our thinking from the concept of Lono, that we receive our spiritual reflection through our women. I have seen many parallels in the conversation and discussion that you have you've talked about today. I relate this history on the basis of being, when you said Japanese look at the inner culture. I'm very interested because you still have temples that exist, that have been there for thousands of years, and are still there. And we are a culture in the process of trying to stop that destruction. Because without the stone and the water, there is no life. And in the concept of, we've been recognized to be highly respected of our individuality. But I see the parallel concept in your individuality thoughts. We are being questioned that we have 4 gods as traditionalists. As contemporary Hawaiians, we have acquired through Christianity the one God concept. And in my studies, it was always a conflict to understand these two, because of covenants and doctrine. And later in life, the understanding from the traditional, which I seem to hear in your discussion today, that power in the sense of 2 temples, in Lono sense, was based on the power to love, to hold, and to share. These concepts are relevant in this conference, but this is an oral culture. We have not been able to express this. So through your speaking this morning, from a Buddhist sense, because I was always trained to say that we are more Buddhist than we are Christian. Okay. And to finish this, our one God concept. As it was told to me by my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father. That 4 gods are the foundation. But there is truly only one God when there is truth between 2 people. Thank you.
少し省略して、通訳させていただきますが、3つに分けて、コメントと、質問をさせていただきますと、まずは私は、ハワイのものでして、河合先生の、ご講演をお聞きして、自分のハワイの、その精神伝統と申しますか、とその共鳴するところが、たくさんございまして、非常に興味深くお聞きさせていただきましたが、具体的な問題として、日本のその仏教、母性原理に基づいているという話をお聞きしまして、我々のハワイの伝統も、やはり似てるところがあるのではないかということを思いながら、しかし日本の場合はその母性原理に基づいたその仏教の、伝統はいまだに活発に続いており、その寺院やその文化はいまだにいろんな形で新しい表現を生み出しながら伝統を守っていると。しかし我々ハワイ人のその、精神伝統は、非常に危うくなっており、そういう、日本の仏教と共通点があるものとしてどういうふうにして生き続けられるのか、そしてその中で、問題としてはその母性面はその、非常に母性面を強調するものとして愛し、お互いに分かち合い、そしてその肉体的にも精神的にも高揚し合う文化であると同時に、やはり自分の伝統を守るために戦いの精神や戦いの神もあるのだと、そういうふうな、その口伝的な伝統に基づく我々の、その精神伝統は、どういうふうに今の時代にその、生き続けられ、また発展できるのかという、質問ですけれども。
どうもありがとうございました。私の話がハワイの方と、共通するというか共鳴する部分があったと言ってくださって非常にありがたく思います。
First of all, let me just say that I'm very grateful that someone who's a native of Hawaii and found something meaningful in my talk, something that resonates with his own concerns and interests.
私の先祖はひょっとするとカワイアイランドにいたんじゃないかと。
Well, I'm thinking, my name is Kawai, so I'm wondering if my descendants don't have some relations to people of Kawai Island.
ジョークは置いておきまして、今その先生も質問されたことと関係してくると思うんですが、自分の伝統的な考えを維持しながら、しかもこの新しい世紀にいかに生きるかということは、これは世界中の非常に多くの人にとって大変な問題だと思います。
I think your question about your own traditions is not unrelated to some of the previous questions. A very difficult challenge, I realize, how it is that one can preserve one's tradition, but also adapt to the rapidly changing circumstances of the world, and not only survive, but flourish into the next century.
で、これ非常に簡単に言ってしまいますと、私は人間がですね、先ほど言われたこととも関係しますが、平和に共存していくということは、自分の心の中に矛盾するものをですね、どれだけ抱きかかえて持っていけるかということにあるんじゃないかというふうに考えています。
This is also related to a previous question about peaceful human coexistence. But I believe that for a human being not only to survive, but to flourish spiritually, culturally, physically, depends at least in part on our ability to embrace, to digest, to transform the contradictions that we find in our own lives.
で、自然科学の体系はその中に矛盾を持ってはいけない。
The way of thinking of modern natural science is based on the principle of contradiction, which does not allow opposite pairs to coexist.
で、したがってその自然科学の体系に従って我々は物事を操作し、オペレートですね、操作したり、コントロールしたりすることができます。
Of course, you may be hearing me making some critical points about modern natural science, but of course, natural science, science and technology are essential for us to be able to control and operate in the world that we live in.
で、だから少し現代人は自然科学の体系を全てであると私は思いすぎているんではないかと思います。
However, there is a limit to the degrees to which we can be truly human by engaging in a mode of existence in which we merely control and manipulate the external world. And I believe that contemporary culture, contemporary human beings in much of the world has become over-reliant on this mode of thinking of science and technology.
少なくとも私自身はですね、他人からオペレートされたりコントロールされたくはないと思っています。
Of course, people do not want to be manipulated or controlled from the outside.
つまり私はそういう矛盾のない体系の中に何かとして入れられてですね、操作されるんではないということですね。
Or another way to put this is, I am not merely a cog in a machine to be manipulated and controlled.
で、つまり私が生きているということは私の中に矛盾を持っている。
What this means is that there's some essential part of me that falls outside the boundaries of what can be controlled by science and technology, precisely because human life is filled with contradictions which go beyond the ability of science to grasp.
だからそれぞれがその矛盾、その人によって違うと思うんですね。その人によって違う大事な矛盾と、その矛盾をどのように生きるかというその使命といいますか、方法によってこそその人の個性というものが出てくるんではないかというふうに考えます。
So we all have inner conflict, inner tension, inner contradictions, which become the very substance of who we are as human beings. And how we tackle the tensions and contradictions in our life, I believe, becomes the deepest expression of our individuality, of our individual lives, individual traditions and cultures.
したがって私は日本に生まれましたが、 あの方はハワイに生まれられました。これはもう決まっていることで仕方ないことです。
So, there are certain facts of existence which we cannot change. I was born in Japan, you were born in Hawaii. These are fundamental facts of our existence.
で、ハワイに生まれ、ハワイの伝統にあるからには、決してそれを否定しない、受け入れる。ただしですね、それだけが大切であって、その考え方で他を全部排除すれば、先ほど言ったように矛盾がないですね。これはダメで、やっぱりハワイの伝統と矛盾する近代の考えというものを取り入れて、その矛盾を自分がいかに生きるかということによって個性も出てくるし、やはり平和共存ということが出てくるんではないかというのが私の考えです。
So, while I myself am rooted in Japanese tradition, you're rooted in your Hawaiian traditions. Neither of us can remain simply within our traditions. We have to deal with what has come from outside. So, for example, we have to deal with the science, the technology, the economic systems, which come from outside. But I believe that this is not merely a problem to be solved, but the fertile ground of a deeper creativity, where our true individuality can be expressed.
今少しハワイの話ですねされましたが、やはり我々はやはりあなたの存在から出てくる話として僕らはその感動して聞くことができます。
And I really appreciated what you had to say, not only because you are Hawaiian and this is taking place in Hawaii, but your question comes from that level of your being which expresses something essential to who you are as a person and as a Hawaiian.
だからそれを大事にしてなおかつその現代のものを取り入れるというその努力を続けるということ以外には方法がないんではないかというふうに私は思います。
So of course, it's difficult for me to offer concrete answers, but I believe that that energy which I found in the way that you expressed the stories and ideas of your culture, that energy that I found is the very energy which will enable you to tackle and integrate the challenges that you face between your own traditions in which you are rooted and the outside forces that you face.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and then we'll take a break for our lunch.
最初のアジャ性コンプレックスの話でちょっと気にかかったことがありまして、仏教は個人主義が利己主義になるのを防いでるみたいな話だったんですけど、僕は長くずっとむしろ逆だと思っていまして、母的に子供が何をやっても受け入れて許してしまうっていうのはむしろ何をやってもいいやっていう方向になって、それでこういうものの場合はそういう考え方がバランスなんでしょうけど、毒にも薬にもなるとしたら、これが例えば戦争状態だったりひどい争いのところだったら薬になるんでしょうけど、今の日本においてはそれは毒にしかなってないように思いまして、でそのことがそのことも別にいいやって言っちゃえばそれまでなんですけど、それをいいやで済ませないでどうなのかなっていうのが一つすごくお聞きしたい点です。
Professor Kawai, when you were talking about the Jōdo-shū complex, at one point you explained that the maternal principle can to a certain extent suppress individualism. And on that point, some thoughts came to mind, out of which a question arose, which I would like to present to you. As it seems to me that the relationship between the individual and the maternal principle, depending on the circumstance, can work creatively or positively, negatively or destructively. And it seems to me that on the one hand, it can suppress individualism, perhaps when it's necessary to suppress individualism, but also the maternal principle can become permissive, perhaps too permissive, so that the mother lets the child do anything whatsoever, and can lead to, for example, your example of a war in which the mother will protect the child no matter what, even when the child causes war and atrocities. And I'm wondering what you think of this point and what is the state of Japan today and how can we deal with it?
マターナル、あるいはパターナルプリンシプルというのはもちろんどちらも必要なんです、私の考えでは。で、先ほど矛盾を持って立ち輝いてというようなことを言ったのもそれがあります。
in speaking about the paternal principle, of course, as I said, I believe that Japanese culture and certain other cultures, Western cultures, may have differences in terms of their focus or emphasis on one or the other. But ultimately, I believe that both are necessary within any particular culture.
しかし、今のご質問に直接に答えますと、そのマターナルプリンシプルというのを、先ほど私が言いました、内と外ですね、どのぐらいの範囲内で適用するか、それをうんと広く適用していくということを考えた場合に、利己的になることを防ぐことができる。それを非常に狭く持っていくと、極めて利己的になるというふうにも言えるというふうに思います。
So there are various ways in which I can respond to your question, but one way is to say that the important thing about the maternal principle is in order that the selfishness of the person living within a maternal culture doesn't get out of control, that they increase the range in which things are included in the insider aspect, and that there is less and less of a differentiation between insider and outsider, because within the insider perspective, it's not merely permissive, but the person who lives within the insider perspective of the maternal principle not only feels embraced, but also has to reflect on their own guilt. And so there is an ethic within the maternal principle.
Well, we want to thank Professor Kawai and all the respondents for their very insightful and meaningful questions and responses, and we'll now adjourn and meet again at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.